You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
Grown-ups, if there's a child in your life who is interested in, curious about, or fascinated by people and places from history, then my podcast, The Past and the Curious, might just be a hit in your home. From the invention of microscopes to world-traveling dogs to fashions of the 1890s, gold rush ghost towns, and audiences going wild for walking competitions, we've got a little bit of it all. Hosted by children's author and museum educator Mick Sullivan, that's me, the show is fun, funny, engaging, honest, and beloved by kids and parents alike. Find The Past and the Curious at all the usual podcast places.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more. Those boobs are not boobs, they're bee larvae. Get used to it.
I'm Jen McMenemy.
And I'm Jenny Williamson, and this is Ancient History Fangirl.
This is the final wonder of the ancient world that we're covering. Today we're going to dive into the wonder that finally broke me. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. This wonder broke my brain, it healed it, broke it again, and maybe summed up the entirety of the wonders for me in a way that I really wasn't expecting. It's no secret that I work slowly and far too close to our deadlines, but with this episode, I really tried to do better. And I did not succeed, but I tried. And part of the reason I struggled with this episode was that I found it really hard to make a linear narrative out of the story of this temple. I kept getting caught in the weeds of how it was built. It was literally built in the weeds, I'm just saying. What the temple looked like and where it was located. And all of the geopolitical things that were going on around it. And all of these things are vitally important. But the most important thing came to me later. The thing that hooked me and made it impossible to stop writing and researching. Who was worshipped at this temple and why? And once I cracked that code, this episode became my obsession. Poor Jenny has had lots of late night texts from me about Artemis and the colonization of her worship. I would say it's been excessive even for me. What do you think, Jenny?
I would say it's about on par.
Okay, Jen's starting to recognize her patterns and maybe try to break them.
I don't mind the wild texts. I do mind the writing close to the deadline part.
So here's the next thing we have to make really clear about this episode and part 2. I wrote this episode throughout the month of October 2024. As we're recording this, it's the Saturday before the U.S. election between Kamala Harris and Donald. I'll be a dictator, but just for one day, Trump.
Donald, I'm going to do it to the women whether they like it or not, Trump.
And here's the thing. It's been impossible for me to write this episode, to do this research at this particular time, and not draw comparisons between what happened to this ancient temple, dedicated to a fierce goddess who refused to marry, who refused to bow to any man, and what is going on in our current political climate. And regardless of what happens in this election, I'm glad our season is ending on these 2 episodes. I'm glad we're finishing out this season with a wonder that was all about feminine power, and quite a lot of rage. I'm glad that we're ending on this sanctuary for people, particularly women, who sought the protection of Artemis. I'm glad that this temple is tied back to other ancient goddesses whose priestesses were transgender. In short, I'm glad this final episode of the season, at least in part, celebrates the badassery of women and the fear that men have had of them since antiquity.
Yeah, I do want to say that this is part 1 of what I believe is going to be 2 episodes. We are currently recording part 1 right before the election. Part 2 is going to have to be recorded after the election, and both of these episodes are going to drop after the election. So the us of the future, which is the present as you're listening to it now, knows things that we don't know right now. as we record this.
So we just don't know what's going to happen, but this is all to say, as Jenny said, when you hear this should all be settled, and you might be like, Jen.
I mean, we've both been white-knuckling this for a long time.
So here's what we're going to do, and here's what we're inviting you all to do with us. We're going to get our drinks of choice, and we're going to give you a story about this temple and the goddess who was worshipped there, and get a little tipsy.
That sounds like a great plan. Let's dive into the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus.
Yes, please.
So, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was located along the coast of what is today Turkey and what would have been Anatolia in the ancient world. This area changed hands and rulers many times throughout the millennia, as it was at a cultural nexus for both the Eastern and Western Mediterranean trade and commerce. According to Ephesus.us, the website, this is what you see when you approach the temple today. Quote, "The Temple of Artemis is known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It has been built in the areas of Ephesus on a flat area, which has over the centuries turned into a swamp. If you visit Ephesus today, you can only see the ruins of the foundations of this marvelous construction of the Hellenistic age, entirely made of marble and full of sculptured columns, capitals, and shafts. Most beautiful columns remaining of this temple are today exhibited in the London British Museum. The oldest remaining column found dates back till the 6th century BC. It was surrounded by 36 huge columns, later enlarged upon the orders of the Lydia king Chrysos during the 6th century BC. Most of the exhibits in the London British Museum belong to this period."
So there is one lone column that still remains standing in a marshy field, and that's what they're talking about. What it means here is the oldest remaining column that's left there in situ still stands.
While the oldest remains of the temple that have been found so far date back to the 6th century BC, as we keep repeating, we have seen older evidence of worship of Artemis in this area, bones, skulls, offerings that predate this building of the 6th century temple. This evidence goes back to around 2,600 years ago, meaning that worship of this goddess has been going on in this area since at least that time, although potentially not in a formal building. The formal stone wonder was built in the 6th century BC after an older version of the temple had been burnt down by arson.
Yeah, and that beautiful one from the 6th century took about 120 years to build. It took a long time. So, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus is unusual for a lot of reasons. The first of which was that it was not tucked away as a mountain sanctuary, which was quite common for many temples at the time. Many of the most famous temples that we think of today were in places like Delphi, which is up a mountain, or they were high on hills dominating a landscape or city. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was not like that. It was not inside a city. It was about a mile outside of the city of Ephesus. And as I've said a few times, it was not high up. It was down in the marshy estuary area where the river met the sea, a place accessible by both boat and road travel. Again, many temples at this time were not necessarily accessible straight on by a harbor. There might have been harbors near them or on rivers sort of further down, a mountain or hill, but most of them were not outside their doors the way we have here. There was a sacred harbor. And you're probably thinking, sure, but the Parthenon literally looms over Athens. It's not tucked away. It's fully on display for everyone to see all the time. And you're right, it was designed that way. But the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was double the size of the Parthenon, and it was built about 100 or so years before it. In fact, the Temple of Artemis, in a lot of ways, was the blueprint for the grand epic Parthenon, and for the temple complex that was built around the statue of Zeus at Olympia. And I cannot stress this enough, the Temple of Artemis was absolutely massive.
So would you say that it inspired those buildings?
Oh yeah, 100%. Some of the people who were working on the temple had an overlap with those who were working on the Parthenon and also on the Temple of Zeus.
Who worked on all of those buildings, theoretically.
Yeah, like there's a few of the people we've talked about already. We'll talk about it in the second episode. Praxiteles and a few other people come in and out of this story again. So, the size of the temple is one of the things that makes it stand out. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, gives us a really good description of the size of the temple. Quote, "The entire length of the temple is 425 feet and a breadth of 225 feet. The columns are 127 in number and 60 feet in height, each of them presented by a different king. 36 of these columns are carved, and one of them by the hand of Scopas, and we'll talk about him. He was a very famous artisan."
This temple was massive, with an impressive amount of columns. How many columns are in the Parthenon?
Well, this is double the size of the Parthenon, so I would imagine it has double the amount of columns, but I don't know for sure. I didn't do that comparison.
Stay tuned for part 2 when we tell you how many columns are in the Parthenon.
If Jenny remembers to ask me when I'm doing the research and I write it down.
Yeah, if I remember to make sure it's in there, because I don't think Jen will.
Absolutely no way I'm topping up my wine glass now.
Questionable with me because I've been drinking since before we started. Anyhow, all of these columns were intricately decorated and dedicated to the temple and the goddess by various kings and leaders. Having a column at this temple was a matter of status and pride, because this temple was a big fucking deal in the ancient world, let me tell you what. But here's the thing, the temple didn't start out as a big deal. In fact, in order to really understand why the temple was so important, why the scale and grandeur of the temple mattered so much, we have to go back to the ancient worship, to a time when the temple didn't exist yet, when all that lay before a traveler to Ephesus was a swampy, marshy area, one that wasn't very well suited to a temple. The Temple of Ephesus was located on a trading route. As Bettany Hughes points out in her book 7 Wonders of the Ancient World, Ephesus was perhaps the first of the 7 wonders that was purposely made to be accessed via sea as well as by river. It is also one of the few, or maybe only, wonders where anyone could visit it. You didn't have to be a king or a queen or wealthy. Men, women, and children were welcomed at this sanctuary.
And it was, in every definition of the word, a sanctuary. You could go there seeking refuge and protection from the goddess. Of course, she had to admit you. The location of the temple is curious. As we've talked about with all of the wonders of the ancient world, there was only one on mainland Greece, and it was not this one. The one on mainland Greece was the statue of Zeus at Olympia.
You mean like there's only one of the 7 wonders that was on mainland Greece?
Of all the 7 wonders of the ancient world, there is only one that was on mainland Greece, and that is the statue of Zeus at Olympia. This one, as I said, is not. Even though it's most commonly associated with the Hellenistic deity of mainland Greece, Artemis, it is located in Turkey, what would have been Anatolia at the time, although it changed hands a lot, that area. As we've said, it was in a fertile, marshy area, not tucked away in the mountains. This temple was placed in a fertile delta where the Castration River meets the sea. This pathway actually formed part of the ancient trading routes, Jenny. Travel up the river further, and you will eventually get to Nineveh and to the maybe location of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So this temple and the city of Ephesus, the ancient city of Ephesus, were a place where Eastern and Western Mediterranean cultures met and traded and exchanged.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important to remember that trading routes in the ancient world often did follow coastlines and rivers. If this temple was placed on a coastline and at the delta of a major river, in a place like Turkey, which was kind of at the nexus of East and West back then yeah, it would have been in the middle of some really important trade routes.
It was. It would. I mean, Ephesus itself, the city, would go on to be like a major capital during the Roman Republican Empire. Like, it was super important. There is evidence to suggest that potentially in ancient times, this temple would have been much closer to the sea than it is now. The research is still ongoing. Like, we think the seashore might have been closer. It's really tough to know. This area, as I've said a lot, has so much seismic activity always going on. We know that it was heavily impacted by the Bronze Age decline and that epic volcanic eruption. We know this was an area prone to landslides and earthquakes. So we think that thousands of years ago, the sea would have been closer to where the temple was. That research is still ongoing. What I want to stress here was that the location was unusual. It was built where it was because it made the temple accessible by pilgrims and by common people, as well as by kings. It was also built here because there was an ancient cultural memory in this spot, a memory of power and fertility that drove ancient people to mark this out as a place where the goddess walked on earth, maybe even the birthplace of the goddess. I didn't get into that in this episode too much because it's so contradictory where she was born, but that's the theory. Bettany Hughes tells us that there is evidence of Artemis, or maybe a more ancient goddess, being worshipped on the site where the Temple of Artemis would be built as far back as 2,600 years ago. And within half a century of the temple being built, this site would become incredibly popular, both to pilgrims and to traders, and to militaries. Ephesus would eventually go on to become one of the largest cities in the ancient world and a center for Roman trade. Accessible by both land and sea, Ephesus was at the heart of trade between the East and West. And it's a place that would play a vital role in so many stories. So many people pass through here who we know their legends of in history. Alexander the Great, Augustus, Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Mark Fuckboy Anthony, Mithridates of Pontus, and so many more. And we will tell their stories in part 2, or some of them.
For now, let's focus on the siren song of this location.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Greenlight helps kids learn about money by actually using it. It's a debit card and money app that teaches kids to earn, save, and spend in real life, not just swipe and hope for the best. Learning happens naturally, in the moment. Parents can set limits, see real-time spending, and guide better habits all in one place, without constant check-ins or cash runs. Don't wait. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/trygreenlight.
The location was right where the sea met the river, and this space was home to so many varied forms of life. Life that can exist only in saltwater or freshwater or that strange in-between brackish water. So basically all the water.
All the water. You had everything lived here. And even like when you go to the site today, you have all these like beautiful bird calls. There's all this wildlife and nature that are just in front of you, deer.
Different kinds of seabirds, different kinds of fish, dolphins. Probably you would see predators like Mediterranean lions and things like that because of all the other prey that you would see here. You know, like animals that were later found to be sacred to Artemis. It's possible that those were endemic to this biodiversity hotspot. Is that possible?
I don't know. So it's very tricky, and we will talk about this in part 2. Based on what they found here. Like, we know they found things like bear teeth necklaces, which I think is super cool. But I don't know that bears were in this area or that they weren't just brought into this area for ritual worship. It doesn't seem like it would be a bear home, but I haven't done that research. And the research I was using didn't tell me whether that was true or not. So I didn't want to say that. But other animals that were sacred to Artemis, like deer and birds and cats and big cats, would have definitely been in this area. And bees.
Right. So you could kind of see how this place would become symbolic of a goddess of fertility and a goddess of the hunt. There would be lots of different animals that you could hunt, and there would be lots of different sort of biodiversity that shows the fertility of this region.
Yeah, and the location here with the temple not being inside the city, it was kind of this gateway between the wilds around and the formal city on the other side. It was kind of like a nice metaphor.
Anyway, so, as we were discussing, this fertile land was wild and untamable in the same way that the goddess was. Fertile and filled with so many varied forms of life, so many species. It was a biodiversity hotspot, like Doggerland.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, like, I now live in an area where the water is brackish, and there's certain types of animals that only live here. Like, you would have been able to potentially have things like freshwater crocodiles and alligators mixing, because there's a certain demarcation. You would have had fish that came in, can only live in salt water that would come up to a point, and then the fresh water on the other side. It's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, in Doggerland, there would have been a lot of brackish water because there were all these incredible mighty rivers, like the most epic rivers of Europe. Those cross that area, they all empty into that sea now. Back then, they would have gone across Doggerland as the sea itself was rising up and reclaiming the land. There would have been a lot of marshes. There would have been a lot of brackish, watery marshland. So anyway, many of the species here would have only thrived in places with the unique conditions of the temple, being a liminal spot where the fresh and salt water mixed. And as Jen said, it was also a liminal spot between the wilds and the city, and a liminal spot between east and west.
And life and death. The wild is always a spot where life is very precious and also very cheap in a lot of ways because you have all these predators and prey amongst each other just struggling.
Yeah. And understanding all of this is crucial to understanding why the temple was so important and how the goddess was worshipped here. So before we get into the temple, because the Temple of Artemis was built and rebuilt several times, don't worry, there's a story, which we'll get to. We want to look at the landscape and the original worship of the goddess. So going all the way back to what the first forms of this looked like.
So one of the earliest statues of Artemis ever in this spot looks confusingly very little like Artemis as she is depicted in most classical sculptures and artwork. In classical sculptures, usually Artemis is depicted as a young maiden wearing a short tunic or maybe a flowing chiton and carrying a bow and arrow. Sometimes she's got dogs following her or deer. She's this perpetually young, usually beautiful woman who is on the hunt. Hunting for what exactly? This is the goddess who told Fuck Daddy Zeus, her daddy, that she would never marry, never take a husband, and would rather remain a quote-unquote perpetual virgin if it meant she retained her autonomy and power and sexual agency, let's be honest. I mean, get it. I'm here for you, Artemis. The Artemis at Ephesus, however, the statue most famously associated with it, embodies parts of the classical goddess, but she is also so much more. And the statue, the famous one from this site that is associated with the temple, is wild. I am talking, of course, about the many-boobed, the many-tittied Artemis. And that is the only way, and perhaps the best way, to describe this Artemis statue. She is covered in boobs on boobs on boobs on boobs.
So many titties. Damn titties.
Damn titties. The wine is kicking in.
Do we sound creepy? Probably.
Most likely. We're your creepy aunts out here. It's fine. Or older sisters.
You know what? I'm never going to stop drinking too much and saying damn titties at inappropriate times. It's just my whole personality.
I know. I wrote this episode for you. So these titties, these boobs, are mostly a very uniform shape. They're sort of egg-shaped. And they cover Artemis's entire chest and her torso. Yeah,
the weird thing about dem titties on Artemis is that they don't actually look very titty-like.
Unless you're like a 14-year-old boy or Jenny. Or me.
I mean, I know what titties look like. I have some. They don't look that titty-like, but who the hell knows? Like, it's a little bit hard to tell what you... I am told that those are tits. Anyway, this is what Bettany Hughes tells us about the ancient statue of Artemis that would have existed on this site. And be warned that what we know for sure is quite vague. Quote, the original statue of Artemis herself, her body made of vine wood or ebony, was probably destroyed in the fire attributed to Herostratus in 356 BC. Take a drink, we'll get there. So, maddeningly, we don't know exactly what form it took in the archaic temple, but Hellenistic and Roman versions, or basically copies from the mid-4th century BC onwards, which seem likely to be versions of the earlier model, make up for any disappointment. Standing boldly in the Ephesus Museum, two of Artemis's cult statues, both found in the Prytanion, or central council chamber of the city, leave no room for doubt that we are in the presence of a goddess. One beautiful Artemis stands nearly 6 feet tall, while the other Great Artemis, these are the names of them, the beautiful Artemis and the Great Artemis, towers 9.5 feet high. Artemis's clothes and body are completely encrusted with bees, lions, griffins, half lion, half eagle. These were a mythical creature often associated with the Amazons, cows, horses, sphinxes. The goddess's front is thick with those heaving, hanging pouches, strange, sensuous swellings that might be ostrich eggs, bags of gold, bull's testicles, breasts, pollen sacs, palm dates, giant acorns, leather purses, drops of nectar, or sacks of honey, a produce which is still a specialty of this pine-rich region. So I think that these are all like theories about what the titty-like appendages were. Whatever those curious bulbous decorations are, they are unforgettable. One interpretation of this remarkable adornment is that the scrota, if indeed this is what they are, gave the goddess the fertility she needed to birth bees, just as the souls of the initiates in her cult would be reborn through their connection with her. So Artemis was not just parthenogenetic. She could bring forth many kinds of life beyond human. Great Artemis's polos, her cylindrical crown, is topped with an image of the temples of Ephesus. Most prominently on the top tier is the Artemision itself. Ephesus' temple wonder is the summation of all of the power of the great Asiatic goddess. So I do feel like there's a lot here that you touch on later.
Absolutely, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't leave anything off this description of the statue, because all of these animals are important, and as Jenny said, we're going to touch on most of them. And The fact that they're here on this statue help us to understand who Artemis at Ephesus was and how she was worshipped. So let's break this down. Long before any temple stood at Ephesus, the site was sacred. As I said before, the first worship probably began around 2,600 years ago. That's when we have evidence of. Could have been even before that. We don't know much more about how she was worshipped, except that people began worshiping the goddess in this space at that time. What did this space look like? We don't know. We found, I guess, bones and things like that date to this time and show us like a ritual collection of them, but we don't know more than that.
Hint, it's some kind of ritual behavior. What kind, we don't know.
Well, we assume it's to do with Artemis based on the types of bones and things that we found. Maybe bear's teeth, things that were sacred to her. The reason we don't know much more beyond this, Jenny, is one big thing that happened in this area that I'm desperate to cover one day, and that is the Bronze Age collapse. Or decline, but I'm going with drama. Collapse. That old chestnut, that old event horizon pops up into our timelines in this area yet again.
It's kind of like the Boudica burn layer. It's this boundary underneath which, beyond which, it's hard to tell what was happening. We know a lot was happening, but it really, that disaster cut us off from our knowledge of the past in a certain way.
It did, and it changed and eradicated coastlines. Like, things were so different afterwards, and how people behaved, their economies, everything changed. There is probably more research, and people much smarter than me doing this work will be able to tell us more in the future, but right now it's still a little sketchy, so bear with me. So, as I said, I'm not going to get too into it, but essentially, because of the location of this site, when the Bronze Age collapse happened, it would have been vulnerable to the raiding sea peoples, who are in my novel, as well as damage from natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, and of course, climate change. Bettany Hughes tells us about the earliest organized worship at the site of the future Temple of Artemis. Quote, in the 14th century BCE, Mycenaean Greeks took Ephesus as a bridgehead into Asia. The Temple of Artemis starts its life at this time, where there is evidence of worship of the freshwater spring Hittite style. Clues include a bronze figure of a Hittite priest and a cult statue that is clearly influenced by Minoan Crete. Visitors and prehistoric influencers would have traveled here across the seas from what is now called Europe. Early Ephesus sat on a ribbon of internationalism and sophistication. Developments in the vicinity had great form. The remnants of one palace settlement further inland at Bakel Sultan appear, for example, to show evidence of underfloor heating dating back in the 2nd millennium BC, 1,000 years before such engineering is officially recognized in archaeology. And I just wanted to share that because it's just so fascinating. We don't know what we don't know, but every time we pull back these layers, we're like, underfloor heating, 1,000 years before we believe that could happen.
That reminds me of the toilets in the Indus Valley.
Yes, I was just going to say it reminds me of the Indus Valley, where it's like there was indoor plumbing or Skara Brae in their toilets, which were not quite as great as the Indus Valley, but they were indoor.
Well, I think the toilets in Skara Brae were probably a little more basic.
They absolutely were so much more basic, but there were like showers in the Indus Valley.
Yeah. The famous Temple of Artemis began its first life in this location in the 6th century BC. But, as we mentioned, worship began long before this time. We know this from evidence found at the site. We can trace worship, probably involving the goddess Hecate, at least according to Bettany Hughes, back to the 900s BC because of the bones of puppies found at the site. So, apparently, there were...
Hang on. It's okay, Jake. It happened a long time ago. He's actually hiding under the blankets right now. It's really funny.
Oh, no. Cover up his little ears while we talk about this. These puppies were apparently killed as part of a ritual, which is quite heartbreaking.
Sorry, Jake.
I would like to say no dogs were traumatized in the recording of this episode, but I cannot say that for sure. Sorry. The first temple would have looked something like this, according to Bettany Hughes in her book 7 Wonders of the Ancient World. Quote, the first archaic stone-built temple of Artemis at Ephesus, dating to the late 700s BC, so this would have been the first formal temple built here, was a wonder for a wide world because at a time when the pecking order in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near and Middle East was still in flux, it constituted the tidal flow of cultural and political sway between East and West. It was also worthy of wonder because it was a temple to humanity's testy relationship with the natural world. By worshipping the goddess of nature, women and men at Ephesus were trying to work out what their contract with the rest of nature should be. Unlike the elite, exclusive palaces of Babylonia, People of all degrees could come here, from farmers to heads of state. With a packed earth floor built at about the same time that Sennacherib was planting his well-watered gardens, this structure was groundbreaking. The first ever colonnaded Greek temple. So it was the first temple that had that sort of Parthenon-style columns, according to this. And it was huge. Ephesus's double colonnades, copied in the later iterations of the building themselves, paid homage to earlier architectural forms from North Africa, the great temple complexes of Egypt at Luxor, Karnak, Abu Simbel, etc. These monstrous glades turned to stone represented giant papyrus reed beds. In Anatolia, the Temple of Artemis was an architectural version of the forests of pine and dwarf oak through which the hunters of the goddess of the hunt, Artemis, were thought to run.
Yeah, they had their own sacred little, forest that they were allowed to hunt in with the goddess's permission. Isn't that cool? Like their own little nature preserve that only they could use.
So are you saying that the marsh outside with all the biodiversity was a wildlife refuge?
Yeah, it was like one of the world's first wildlife refuges. Yeah, you weren't allowed to hunt or do anything there without the goddess's permission. It's something that Augustus will run afoul of, I believe, in part 2. So, you'll notice all of these quotes and facts I've given you are very much in line with how we perceived Artemis according to the classical Greeks and Romans. And the only source I found for them have been Bettany Hughes, which is why I've quoted from her. But didn't I say that Artemis in this area looked and behaved very differently? I did. So why all these quotes? I wanted you to hold 2 things in mind at once. 1, Artemis functioned for some pilgrims and worshippers, just like the ancient Greeks and Romans would have you believe. But for others, she was different, even more ancient and associated with other Mediterranean cultures. As we said before, the original statue of Artemis, or the version of Artemis that was worshipped at the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, would have been very different from the lithe maiden with a bow and arrow the classical Greeks worshipped. And even before the image of the many-titted Artemis, the most ancient conception of Artemis was very different than how we imagine her. So essentially, Jenny, the most ancient version of Artemis she was kind of a lump of wood. Maybe a lump of wood from under the tree in which she was born, or maybe just something that they thought was God-touched. And she was held behind a curtain, this lump of wood, this plank that they believed to be Artemis, and they would bring her out for ceremonial reasons, and they would drape her in flowers and clothes. They would give this wood ritual sort of baths and cleansings with spring water. It was really fascinating, and this is the information that we get from Bettany Hughes about how that worship would have looked.
What was she decorated with again?
She would have been decorated with flowers and rich clothes and fabrics of all different colors. Think like reds and purples and all those luscious and luxe dyes. She would have been covered in gold. They would have put oil and moisturized this wood to keep it from getting dried out. She might have had things like olive oil, fig milk, grape juice. She might have been doused in wine sometimes based on the ceremonies.
I didn't know fig milk was a thing.
I didn't either, but that is a thing that Bettany Hughes tells us. So we can milk an almond and a fig. I mean, to be honest, fig milk makes a lot of sense. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but at this time in Europe, there wasn't a lot of ways to sweeten things unless you sort of infuse them with fruit or honey. And figs are naturally really sweet, delicious fruit. So I can see squeezing a fig and using that juice to sort of make something really tasty.
Okay, so let's break this down. The most ancient version of Artemis, the version of the goddess that was worshipped and prayed to starting maybe as old as 2,600 years ago, would have been essentially a wooden plank. It reminds me of the Shigar idol. That's what I'm thinking of. This is an episode we did on our Patreon. This is from a place probably thousands of miles north of here in either Russia or Siberia or somewhere. I'm not looking at the research right now, but it's called the Shigar idol, and it is a wooden plank. It is also extremely visceral and creepy, and that's kind of what I'm imagining here is it's a plank, but it's imbued with this incredible spiritual charisma and power, and you would probably sense it just walking into the room with it, right? That's what I'm picturing. So it's not like this silly thing like, oh, it's a plank. It would have been this visceral, possibly carved and decorated ritual object. So anyway, the most ancient version of Artemis, the version of the goddess that was worshipped and prayed to, starting maybe as old as 2,600 years ago, would have been essentially a wooden plank, an idol not made of gold or ivory or marble, but wood, probably found somewhere around the site where the temple was founded. A piece of wood thought to be divine, God-touched, and sacred. And this wood eventually was covered in ribbons, jewels, draped in fine fabrics, and paraded around as part of worship and ceremonies. How do we know this? Has the plank been found?
No, the plank can't be found because the original temple burned down. We're going to talk about that. But we know that this is what the original idol would have looked like based on the worship in this area and what they would have used. Remember, this is quite a long time ago. The luxurious, amazing temple of Artemis that was built came very much in the future. So, while this idea of this wooden plank might sound kind of bizarre to outsiders, I have to say that I see so much of the worship of Mary in the Catholic religion here. Mary, the Virgin Mother of Jesus, is iconic in the Catholic and other Christian religions. There's a lot of iconography and imagery of her. Many churches have statues of her. Usually she's draped in a blue robe, which is the color of the sky. She always looks very young and demure, not quite as fierce as Artemis, but young, and very holy, with a little halo over her head to tell you that she is a saint and maybe semi-divine. And why am I mentioning Mary? Well, worship of her was also tied to Ephesus and Artemis. But for the moment, what I remember most about growing up and going to Catholic school was the month of May, which was dedicated to Mary. And you would make offerings to the statue of flowers. You would say your prayers and in general, speak to the statue that was supposed to hear you and help you with your problems. Mary is a patron saint of many things, including childbirth, children, young women, mothers, the sick. And I feel like the statue I remember best was made of wood, essentially just like an ancient idol, like the plank of wood that was supposed to represent Artemis. And it was also adorned with flowers, and it was taken really well care of. And I just wanted to throw this in here because, yes, there's an Artemis-Mary connection, but also because in modern religions, we still hold on to these sacred ancient roots of worshiping a God-touched piece of wood, of worshiping these kind of idols.
So Google the sugar idol and Google, a statue of Mary, and probably that plank is somewhere in between the two.
Yeah, probably closer to the sugar idol, but who knows?
You'll never be able to unsee it.
Yeah, and we don't know what that plank could have looked like anything. Like, I've seen so many creepy planks of wood.
Yeah, I have too. Like, I've walked into rooms in museums where there's this stump pulled out of a peat bog that has been worshipped for thousands of years, and you feel it. I'm not religious, but you feel that intensity gathered in this ritual object.
We just did a whole episode on our Patreon about jack-o'-lanterns, and we talked about how the original ones were made of turnips. And if you ever Google ancient Irish turnip jack-o'-lanterns, they look like heads and they're creepy and they have this aura to them. There's so much in the natural world that feels imbued sometimes with other things, whether you're religious or not. So let's get back on track. The most ancient form of Artemis that was kept at the temple as an idol or a statue was most likely a piece of wood. And this piece of wood was sacred and worshipped and holy. It was decorated, it was revered, it was without a doubt vital to the mystery cult here.
And for all of those reasons, a dude named Herostratus on July 21st, 356 BC, decided to burn down the first temple of Artemis. That date is famous in ancient history for another reason. It was the day that Alexander the Great was born. And yes, Alexander will have a part to play in this wonder, but not just yet. So let's focus on Herostratus for now. Herostratus was an enslaved man who perhaps was trying to protest his enslavement. It's a theory that has come down to us, but many historians, including Bettany Hughes, believe that what Herostratus wanted was actually fame. He wanted infamy and to inspire fear. He wanted to destroy. He wanted to be known by the world. And we know that he's kind of a, ancient world troll is what I'm picking up.
It kind of reminds me of the 2019 movie, The Joker. He just kind of reminds me of that tortured guy who just wants everyone to feel his pain.
I feel like the Joker, I didn't watch the movie, but just when I read some think pieces, the vibe I get is it's coming from an incel place. I don't know if that's the case here.
I don't know. It's very difficult to parse out what the case is here because Herostratus was an enslaved person. You have to include that when you talk about him.
Yeah, and I'm sure if he wanted to lash out, it probably had more to do with that. than modern incel problems. Like, I'm not saying it's the same thing at all. Yeah.
Same. I'm not saying that either. But the fact that he chose to burn down this temple, there's also an underlying current of like getting back at a very powerful goddess who potentially wasn't protecting him, which is fair. He obviously didn't know Artemis very much because she was very fickle.
Anyway, so according to some theorists, Herostratus was looking for fame and infamy. And we know this because the temple and worshippers were so upset with this crime that they forbade anyone from mentioning his name. He was damnatio memoriae, if you will. This was a crime punishable by death. Did he wind up getting executed, or do we not know that?
Oh, he wound up getting executed. So Bettany Hughes tells us he was captured, racked, and then executed.
Aha, so here is an early example of the use of the rack, which I remember trying to track down for a different episode at one point. So basically, the temple and its worshippers were quite upset with Herostratus, and they forbid his name from ever being mentioned, which of course just meant that his name got leaked out to the rest of the world, and today he is very much remembered for his crime. Because that's what happens if you're damnatio memoriae. It just means you're infamous, everyone remembers. And let's be clear, his crime was awful. The fire he set burned down the ancient temple, destroyed much of the complex, and most importantly, destroyed the piece of wood that served as the representation of the goddess. The ancient temple was gone in one night. So was this was the ancient temple that was the giant colonnaded edifice that was...
This was the one before that, I believe.
Do we know what that looked like?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so we don't actually know what that one looked like, and all mentions of this massive, enormously colonnaded temple are about the second temple that was built after this one.
As far as I know, yes, that's what I've taken from this, is the one that comes after this is the one that Croesus gave all the money to build, the massive colonnaded one.
Okay, so the original one is a mystery. We don't know what it looked like, and it was gone in one night in this horrible fire. And we will talk about what came next, the ancient wonder that was raised on this site, because the second building, apparently funded by Croesus himself, that was the wonder that we're talking about.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
By the time I hit my 50s, I'd learned a few things, like how family is precious. Work can always wait. And 99% of people over 50 already have the virus that causes shingles. Not everyone at risk will develop it, but I did. The painful, blistering rash disrupted my life for weeks. Don't learn about your shingles risk the hard way. Talk to your doctor or pharmacist today. Sponsored by GSK.
It's the Paradise Podcast.
I am your host, Ryan Michelle Bethay, with my husband, Sterling.
What's up?
Join us here on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus, where we'll discuss each episode with the cast and crew of Paradise. I'll be getting all the secrets from Dan Fogelman, James Marsden, Shailene Woodley, Julianne Nicholson, and Sterling Kelby-Brown. Woo! Paradise, the official podcast, is now streaming.
And stream Paradise on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus.
Anyway, so the ancient temple was gone in one night, and we'll talk about what came next, the ancient wonder that was raised on this site, this many-columned inspiration for the Parthenon. But for now, we want to stay here with the why of this fire. Why was this fire set? Why this goddess? What did Herostratus and others fear about her, and why was she so revered and dangerous?
All right, let's get into it. Jenny, what do you know about bees?
And probably kind of a lot. I mean, my dad had kept bees when I was a kid, and there's still some of the honey left over. I have a jar of it.
Awesome. Honey never goes bad, by the way. It keeps forever. So I want to stop for a minute and talk about the boobs and the bees. So remember that famous many-boobed statue of Artemis, the one we only have like images of through replicas. Smaller copies of what was probably a much larger statue. Replicas sold to the markets of Ephesus. Maybe even inside the temple itself as a keepsake or maybe an idol for worship. These replicas show us what the lost original statue of Artemis at Ephesus, the one that would have taken center stage in that rebuilt temple, would have looked like. And It's all about the tits.
Yeah, so let's be clear. The many-boobed statue of Artemis is what arose in the temple after the plank statue had been burned down. It's like version 2 of Artemis, shall we say.
We went from sacred wood to sacred boobs. So, for a while, these boobs really confused historians. I mean, there's still a debate as to what they were. Probably not boobs. Artemis is known for a lot of things in Greek mythology, right? She turned Actaeon into a stag and set his hunting dogs upon him, tearing him limb from limb after he caught her bathing. She killed Orion in some myths because he either tried to assault her or one of her handmaidens, not cool, or he boasted he was a better hunter than her. The myths conflict here. But what they are very clear about is that Artemis did not just flash her many, many titties. At least not in front of men. In front of her handmaidens, anything goes.
Well, being covered in boobs isn't necessarily one of the things she was known for in the official classical mythology.
Absolutely. I mean, the one thing you know about Artemis was she was all about that sacredness of like your body having autonomy, not having your nudity being on display for people, right? You never see her naked.
But she was also like a very sort of lithe, athletic young maiden in the classical artwork. She wasn't this sort of, fertility goddess with so many boobs.
No, but what we know about her from mythology is that if you saw her boobs, you died. So having this statue of Artemis that's just all these tits out feels really weird.
The fact that the tits are there and the fact that they're just out, those are the two things that are strange.
I mean, in classical mythology, she definitely has boobs.
But just the standard 2, though.
Yes, just the standard 2. And it might not be that weird because while I was doing this research, I found out that Artemis is associated with bees. Now, I never knew that. I knew bees were associated with Dionysus for wine reasons, but also they're associated with Artemis. Bees were said to be the messengers of the gods. They could move between the earth and the heavens. Presumably, they could also go to the underworld if they wanted. They were communal creatures who lived in a hive. They produced honey, which was the main way of sweetening anything in the ancient world, besides, I suppose, infusing something with like a really sweet fruit, right? But as we talked about in our Patreon episode, some fruits that are like sweet to us today didn't always taste the same way they do now, like fruits like watermelon.
Over the millennia, the cultivation and domestication of fruits has produced changes in taste. Case in point, as Jen said, watermelons during ancient times were bitter fruits that were used only for medicinal and water storage purposes. Which is wild, right? And we have a longer episode about the history of watermelon that Jen did in video form on our Patreon. It is really fun. Sign up if you want to see that. Anyway, all that is to say that honey was incredibly important in the ancient world, particularly across the Mediterranean, Egypt, and Asia. And the ancient peoples domesticated and farmed honey from bees, and what they noticed was that there weren't any male bees.
Sometimes people believed like honey was like a nectar or like a part of ambrosia, was like a food of the gods or had like special magical properties. Things conflict, but that is something that the ancients did believe.
That actually isn't correct, by the way. There are, in fact, male bees. But if they're just going off of what they observed in nature, I don't know how they would even tell the sex of a bee.
I guess the size. I'm assuming that the female bees are bigger than the male bees, and they probably didn't see as many male bees. Or the other way around. I don't know.
Anyway, overwhelmingly, the breakdown of any beehive skews female. As we know, the workers are female. It's the default sex. Hives have one queen bee and one drone, or male bee, for every 100 female worker bees. The male bees, or drones, their only job is to mate with the queen, and they have no stingers, so they can't protect themselves or the hive, and they also can't collect nectar. They have just one job, and the women do everything else. Anyway, so what do bees have to do with Artemis's titties? That is the question we're all asking because we're all very focused on the chestal area right now, as you would be if you've Googled this statue. Anyway, so it turns out that they have a lot to do with those titties because the boobs, according to some historians, aren't boobs at all, but bee larvae. That's right. Artemis's boobs might in fact be bee larvae. This is a theory. There are others connected to other goddesses, but in short, the theory that we're talking about here is that those boobs are not boobs, they're bee larvae. Get used to it. So our very private goddess, who never let men see her titties, is not covered in boobs, she's covered in bees. Baby bees.
Which she produced asexually because they did not understand how you made baby bees. So I'm going to have to read this quote because it's quite important. Bettany Hughes tells us why this theory is actually quite sound. It all relates to how Artemis was worshipped, particularly here at Ephesus. Quote, Artemis's cult was celebrated and maintained predominantly by the female of the species, usually young maidens, parthenoi, the etymology explaining why Artemis was parthenogenetic, a maiden or a virgin creator, and unmarried women. But there were special high priests too, the megabaizoi, eunuchs, men who castrated themselves for the goddess. The idea here, and this is why I had to include this quote because it's so wild, the idea was that Artemis's ferocious female fecundity could not stomach the threatening, polluting challenge of male presence. Early ivory figurines of these eunuch priests have been discovered at Ephesus. The name megabaizoi means drones or the serving ones. Artemis's priestess equivalents were melissae, the honey women. We can imagine the entire temple being conceived as a giant beehive. Later cult statues of the goddess show Artemis's dress covered with fat bees, flanked by their hives. She was also depicted with manifold breast-like appendages, which could well be pollen sacs. The Temple of Artemis was an outsized home for a busy population, a safe house for golden treasure, and a celebration of the sophisticated, carefully balanced systems of the green planet.
Wow.
It's just so incredible.
I love that the male priests, or, eunuchs, I don't know if they identified as male, but they were the megabaizoi, they were the drones, and the cisgender women who are priestesses were the honey women. We could assume that they were like the female worker bees, right? So this was all conceived as a giant hive. That's amazing.
Yeah, and when we talk about what the temple complex looked like, you're going to see more of that in how it was built and how it worked. And I wanted to just break this down a little bit. The temple complex at Ephesus was actually hive-like. The temple functioned as a hive. And we will discuss this properly in part 2, but ancient temples functioned kind of like a bank for many ancient kings and kingdoms. And the feeling here was that no one would dare steal from a god or goddess. So the money or gold or treasure or wards, maybe children, if they were like next in line to inherit, were safe being stored at a temple. And this was never more the case than in the Temple of Artemis.
Turns out that that's not entirely true, but stay tuned for part 2 on that one.
It's not always true. In addition to functioning as a bank/treasury, and I have to say this, the bank treasury Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was incredibly wealthy. It had some of the most wealth and prized possessions, jewels, literature, scribes, learning in the entire ancient world. So in addition to functioning this way, the temple, as I mentioned, had a library with repositories of some of the most important works of the ages stored right there in the open for anyone to read.
So anyone could read there?
Yeah, you had to petition the goddess for sanctuary for permission to enter, and if she gave it to you, yeah. And as I just said, the temple most importantly offered sanctuary to anyone who sought it and met with the goddess's approval. And that's super important, particularly where Ephesus is centered. There was a lot of war and fighting going on throughout the history of this temple. And it was important that there was a sanctuary, somewhere where refugees could go and be taken in. And that is also a function of this temple. So as long as the goddess gave you approval to be there, you were granted divine sanctuary. And once you were given sanctuary at the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, you were safe from your enemies as long as you remained within the temple. It wasn't always the case, but this episode needs to stay on topic. And the topic here is about the worship of Artemis at this site. So let's just recap. The temple complex would have been laid out essentially like an ancient hive, and the people here would have been doing kind of the work of bees. They would have been all working to take care of their queen, make sure that she's provided for. That queen is the goddess Artemis. And that is why that we think that those boobs on the torso of Artemis are not in fact boobs, but potentially pollen sacs or bee larvae.
Well, if they're bee larvae, that actually makes sense because she's the queen bee, right? That's how she reproduces. Or at least that's how the ancients would have believed that bees reproduce.
Exactly. And remember, at this point in time, they did sort of, I don't think you can ever really domesticate a bee, but they kind of had, they knew how to collect honey. So they knew what the inside of a hive looked like, even if they didn't quite understand the finer structures like we do now. So they would have known what this would have looked like. They would have built things to look like that because, the bees do this and it works really well.
Right. So there's more compelling evidence for the bee association at this site. The ancients believed, as I kind of alluded to just now, that Artemis was able to reproduce without having sex, much like how they thought a queen bee reproduced. So they believed that queen bees reproduced asexually. The priestesses of Artemis were called the honey women, and they were in charge of maintaining the temple and leading the worship of the goddess. Priests of Artemis were called megabyzoi, which means drones, as in male bees or servants. Worship of Artemis revolved around women having the power in these rituals, in their sacred spaces and temples, and men being given a seat at the table if they castrated themselves for the goddess, as they should.
I mean, there's always a trade-off for power, right?
And castrating yourself for power is definitely a trade-off a lot of people made in the ancient world and, even into medieval times sometimes.
Artemis herself as a goddess, like if we assume that she was a perpetual virgin, right? That she gave up her sexuality in order to have the power to never be bowing to a man or anything else like that. Like, that's all she's asking her priests to do.
Yeah, give up your sexuality. Not hard.
That was the bargain I had to make to have this power.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would say that that bargain of goddesses, specifically in classical Greek mythology, having to give up your sexuality for, I guess power would be the wrong word, like agency. Agency and independence. Like, we have a lot of very independent goddesses who are also virgins. You see a lot of this, virginity paired with agency that I've definitely noticed. And I don't think that that's always how Artemis was conceived. I think it's how Artemis was conceived in the Greek world.
That's not how agency was always conceived either, not even in Ephesus. Ephesus actually had a lot of powerful women who had agency regardless of their marital status. We're going to talk about it.
I don't know if the priestesses were allowed to be married or...
No, priestesses and priests of Artemis were not allowed to marry. Women were expected to remain virgins, no sex at all. That was what you did to have that communion with your god. That was what that god demanded. And in order to do that, you had a certain kind of agency and a certain kind of power and respect in society.
No sex.
No boning.
None. Do not bone. Anyway, so we talked about another goddess cult where the priests were also asked to castrate themselves, or perhaps it was a demand, or perhaps it was optional. I really don't know. There are others that we've studied at our goddess, Sibyl. One of those goddesses, at least, that we've studied before, makes an appearance at Ephesus too. I say Sibyl, Jen says Cybele, probably more accurate. The image we're getting of the Artemis at Ephesus is very different from the normal, or at least the classical version of her that we're all used to. She's not just a huntress and goddess tied to the moon. She's not just the protector of the forest and wild places. She's not just the goddess of young women in childbirth, or the goddess of the hunt. Here at Ephesus, she is a mother goddess. A goddess who looks after her worshippers like a queen looks after her hive, who gives protection and aid to those who seek it. Her fertility and power are so great that men who wish to become her priests are asked or demanded or insisted upon they must castrate themselves as part of their transformation into being vessels who serve the goddess.
I had done the research for the other Artemis episode maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I couldn't really recall ever having seen her referred to as a fertility goddess. Jenny tells me that I have seen it and I just forgot it.
I could have sworn it was in that episode, but maybe I'm wrong.
It probably is, because that's a very comprehensive episode, except it doesn't cover any of the stuff we're covering here.
So anyway, it's not that common that we've seen Artemis referred to as a fertility goddess before. There's a reason for that. This version of Artemis, this mother goddess part of her, is tied to her Asiatic roots and not her Greek ones. Artemis, particularly Artemis at Ephesus, is linked to the ancient goddess Sibyl or Cybele, who we've talked about before on the podcast, and who is known as the Great Mother Goddess. She is a goddess of fertility and wild animals. Worship of her across Asia Minor, Anatolia, Thrace, and Phrygia was very common. Worship of Cybele or Sibyl spread to Greece and Rome, and in Rome she would become known as the Magna Mater, or Big Mother.
Big Mama! The mother of all.
Yes, and this goddess, we talked about her. Cybele or Sibyl was usually depicted riding a chariot and flanked by lions.
What was one of those animals that was on that statue of Artemis? Was it a lion?
Probably lions stalking those marshes and hunting animals, right?
But also those lions are tied back to this goddess. Like these animals that we see on that statue of Artemis, that very unusual statue of Artemis, tie back into these older ancient goddess roots.
Yes.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws. I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1. On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
Do you want to live longer, think faster, or just perform better at everything? I'm Dave Asprey, and I founded the biohacking movement to show you that you can take control of your own biology. I created the Human Upgrade podcast to show you exactly how. Discover the protocols that upgrade your mitochondria, optimize your brain, and transform your performance at every level from spiritual all the way down to your cells. You can learn from more than 1,400 people who've been on the show, including world-class scientists, and you can apply what works today by filter out the BS for you. Skip the guesswork, learn how to get the results to feel healthier and happier. Subscribe to the Human Upgrade podcast and start biohacking your life. You might really like the way you feel.
Anyway, so Cybele or Sybil famously turned Atalanta into a lion when she caught her and her husband fucking in her temple because she was not pleased with that. Turning someone into a lion who fucked in your temple is a very Artemis thing to do, if you ask me. Anyway, we talked about Sybil before in our episode about transgender Aphrodite, and her priestesses, called the Galli, were also asked to castrate themselves. I love that you phrase it as asked to castrate themselves, because it sounds so polite, and I'm like actually not sure if they were asked to do this. It may have been mandatory, it may not have been mandatory, I really don't know, but asked to castrate themselves is a funny way to say it.
Well, it's kind of not, having grown up sort of religious. Like, I kind of feel like it was part of what they were asked to do in order to join that cult and to be a part of the role they wanted to take on. I mean, for them, it was a real choice they were making as part of their devotion to this goddess and who they were. And I just wanted to give it that agency as opposed to being like they were forced to or whatever. It was something they chose to do because of who they were and how they felt about their goddess and this transformation they were undergoing.
I mean, I can't say how consensual this always was. You know, like I don't want to paint it that way when it wasn't that way. I can't say whether people made a decision to do this under the influence of something, or I really don't know, and we can't know because that would have been part of the mystery cult.
Absolutely. So I'm giving you both sides. I wanted Jenny to be able to give you one side, and I'm giving you the other.
Also, like, in terms of being asked to castrate yourself, like, how much of that had to do with their gender expression?
Yeah, and I just wanted to be very clear about that because we've talked about the Galli before, and they
were basically transgender women. Most of them, and like I said, we can't really exactly track everybody's gender identity to the way that people would conceive of that in modern times, but the religious idea of this is that the goddess had the power to change men into women and women into men, so this gender transition would have been part of their conception of their goddess's power. Anyway, so the priestess of Cybele, or Sybil, called the Galli, also sometimes possibly castrated themselves or were castrated as part of their worship of the goddess. And Galli were believed to have been transformed or transitioned into women by their goddess. So was it the same for the Megabyzoi? We don't know. We do know that this was a position of honor. This is what Strabo, writing from 64 BC to 21 AD, somewhere in there, tells us about the Megabyzoi. Quote, "They had eunuchs as priests, whom they called the Megabyzoi, And they were always in quest of persons from other places who were worthy of this preferment, and they held them in great honor. And it was obligatory for maidens to serve as colleagues with them in their priestly office. So I actually remember finding this quote too when I was doing research into like different types of gender expression in the ancient world, and I was trying to learn about eunuchs. And what I picked up from this quote, which I think is the only thing we have written down about the megabyzoi as far as I know.
That's all we have. I don't have any deep dives. This is all the information.
Like basically what I can glean from that, not only is that this is a position that would have had a lot of respect associated with it, but also that they were diverse. They were trying to source the megabyzoi from lots of different regions and areas.
And I want to remind you that this is a place, it's a meeting place, Ephesus. There would have been people from all over. This was so diverse. They were from every corner of the Mediterranean and northern Africa, down from Thrace and the Scythians. Like, this was a huge cultural meeting point where they would find really diverse people, and they were trying to source the ones that they felt worthy of this honor, worthy, in touch with, God touched, whatever you want to say, to worship this goddess.
Yeah, we don't know what they would have considered as like qualifying factors.
As both Jenny and I said, this is literally it from the ancient sources. And it seems that these priests were highly respected in Anatolia, and based on what I saw, maybe less so in mainland Greece and Rome, where they have some issues with some toxic masculinity on the rise. Were the megabyzoi believed to be transformed into priestesses and then worthy of serving their goddess, like the priestesses of Cybele, or was something else going on here? We really just don't know.
Like, we don't know about their own gender identity. It's not really recorded.
It's not really recorded. We knew about the Galli because there's a lot of times wherein after they had transitioned into being priestesses, they're referred to as like she, and that's their identity. I would like to think that potentially it's the same.
The fact that the megabyzoi means drones, which is a male bee, what that signifies to me is that they retained their gender identity as men and that this was a male position. I don't know for sure, but that's what the clue seems to be.
But that clue that we're getting is coming down from a Greek writer or a Greek translation that may not be the same as how they felt. Let's keep going. So in addition to being a fertility goddess, a goddess with eunuch priests, and a goddess who is said to come from around the same area as Artemis's Ephesian temple, Cybele was also called the mistress of animals. And this is a name associated, again, with Artemis, our mistress of animals, our mistress of the wild and the hunt. Here's another suggestion at what those boobs, I'm still obsessed with Artemis's titties. Here's another thing that these titties might have been. They might have, in fact, been bull's testicles. Those boobs might not have been boobs at all. They might have been balls. Bull's testicles were sacred to Cybele and were often used in worship of her. And these bull's testicles were often hung around the statues of Cybele or idols of Artemis here at Ephesus. And the connection here between the two goddesses might give us a clue about what those titties were. Also, testicles would have been considered important to fertility and fertility rites. So that's a theory. So Bettany Hughes again tells us a little bit more about the Asiatic Artemis at Ephesus. Quote, the Asiatic Artemis at Ephesus in the same way took on the guise of Cybele, the mistress of animals and the mother of the gods. So when we think of the temple of Artemis and the goddess that the sanctuary honored, we must suppress all notions of a classical wispy-togaed Diana figure and think instead of a summation of nature's primal power. Artemis at Ephesus was considered to be a goddess who decided whether humans lived or died. And at Ephesus, this petrifying power, on occasion, took on an enlightened and positive form. Diana is obviously the Roman name for Artemis. Artemis and Cybele are both goddesses with an incredible power. They were personifications of nature, not the elements. Interestingly, they're not the god of the sea like Poseidon, or the sky like Zeus, or the wind like Boreas. But they were nature itself, the wild animals who might attack, the beasts that prowled under the cover of night, the bees that worked together for their survival, and the birds that dipped and played amongst the sea and the river. This depiction of the goddess is kind of terrifying, right? It's nature unleashed in a way that is primal and fierce, a way that was terrifying to the men of ancient Greece and Rome. And there's another thing that I didn't put in here, but the other thing that they're talking about with this Artemis is she had the power over life and death. She could be the bear that comes down and kills you at night, but she could also be the goddess who opens her temple sanctuary to the refugees who came looking for help. She could be the mama bear who raised Atalanta. We don't know.
So worship here at Ephesus also showed signs of crossover with the Egyptian deity cat goddess Bastet. Bastet was both a nurturing goddess and a violent one. She could be maternal and protective, but she was also dangerous and unpredictable. She was one of the most revered and powerful goddesses in the pantheon and was also a goddess of childbirth, fertility, and the brutality of nature. There's a lot of alignment here. So finding evidence of her worship and her symbols here at Ephesus just shows us the story that was coming together at this temple.
Bastet would have had a massive crossover here because of the location of the temple and because of the fierce nature of Artemis. There were a lot of big cats, lions, and things that we see in the iconography at Artemis's temple. But also Artemis and Bastet were both goddesses of childbirth. They were goddesses of fertility, and they were brutal. They were like a mama cat.
Yeah, they weren't domesticated. They were not domesticated goddesses of fertility and childbirth. They were very much like wild goddesses of fertility and childbirth, where that quality is part of their wildness and not part of the home, hearth, and family that the Greeks were always trying to pin women down to.
No, this is not Hestia. This is not Vesta. This is not a woman who stays at home. This is a mama cat who looks after you while you need her. And then literally when you're old enough, pushes you out to go hunt and live and die on your own. And that's it. And I love that so much. Anyway, the temple that we're talking about had become a place of power and the melding of many ancient goddesses, fierce goddesses whose stories and exploits would have been told and carried across the ancient trade routes that ran in and out of Ephesus, along which merchants shipped goods from east to west and back again. Again, this is a lot like the story of Dionysus, whose exploits were told along the ancient wine route. That's what we're seeing here with this Artemis.
Well, it's also really interesting that like Dionysus and like Aphrodite, this is an ancient goddess whose roots go back to Asiatic area. And the version of that deity that existed to the east, things tend to translate and be carried over and sometimes subsumed in that Greek identity. And some of that is gender fluidity.
Absolutely. We see that with Aphrodite and Dionysus, and that's exactly what we're seeing here.
With the megabaizoi. It's super interesting that gender fluidity is always a really, really ancient aspect of these deities that comes from those Asiatic roots.
Yeah, and it seems to be something that in particular is very quickly sanded off and reverted the further you go into the stories of them in both Greece and much more so in Rome, when gender is much more codified. You see this very fluid, powerful deity who, as we go along, again, I'm thinking of Dionysus, goes from being this really fluid, fascinating character to Cuervo guy, a frat boy. It's wild.
Right, and in the case of Artemis, she goes from being this incredibly fiercely fecund goddess who's so fertile and so female and wild in her femaleness that men have to castrate themselves to serve her, basically. She goes from that to being just the main thing about her sexuality is that she is a virgin.
Yeah, she goes from being able to reproduce without the need of men or anything else to give this incredible life to being I will never have sex or talk to men. I'm just going to stay like Peter Pan, a 14-year-old girl all the time. Ha, that's how I win. And in particular, that happens as we get more and more into the Romanization of these gods and goddesses.
Any agency that women had to be sexual outside of home, hearth, and family and husband frightened them very much. And to reproduce, even if we're talking about a goddess like Artemis, who I don't know if she was having sex, but she was definitely reproducing without the help of men. The idea of reproducing without men would have terrified them.
Oh, the men were literally clutching their pearls. They were horrified. If you don't need us to reproduce and you can protect yourself and you're fierce and you're powerful and you have agency over nature and the wild, well, what are we doing here? I don't know. What are you doing here?
Nothing if you're not going to castrate yourself.
Sorry, the wine is kicking in and the election anxiety is kicking in.
You can see how gender was built as a construct in this area, at least the Western concept of gender, and how it affects us still today.
Yeah, it's a colonization of gender. It's really about putting things into boxes that we're seeing here. And it's still here today. I really felt it was really important that when I was doing this research that we end here and remind everyone that this has been here since the beginning. Most gods and goddesses have been sort of very fluid in their gender identity. Even Zeus, the not a gender rebel fuck daddy of all gods, sometimes was a woman or a shaft of light or, I don't know, a horse or whatever.
Definitely gave birth without the help of women several times.
Exactly. There is a fluidity that gets lost when we try to put people in boxes.
So, The Temple of Artemis became a symbol of wild and dangerous female power.
Hot.
Sexy. And while the goddess who was most famously worshipped there was Artemis, she was also a compilation of other goddesses, all melded into one epic, terrifying goddess who demanded obedience and sacrifice, and sometimes castration.
I demand obedience and sacrifice.
Made men castrate themselves. Or perhaps Jen thinks they politely asked men to castrate themselves.
I'm not thinking like in my polite British, like, oh, would you mind terribly? I think it's like...
That's exactly what I'm picturing. Pardon me, but would you mind?
I'm sorry, we would so like it if you joined the cult, but unfortunately, you have these two dingleberries. If you don't mind terribly...
There's this small matter of your testicles.
As I'm petting my poor dog laying here, I'm like, well, you could be a priest of Artemis.
He's already mostly there. Anyway... So the next topic we have to discuss here is the Amazons and the worship of Artemis. So the Amazons are tied into this.
And we will get to the story of the Amazons and how that relates to Artemis at Ephesus in the next episode. That's it for this week. Find us on social at Ancient History Fangirl on Threads and Instagram, where we're most active. And we're on TikTok, same handle. We're not as active, but we try. And you can find our Patreon at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl.
Bear in mind that as of November, we are not available to buy a membership on the iOS app, so your iPhone or iPad, you can still listen to the episodes on those devices, the Patreon episodes on those devices, but we just won't be available to buy a membership through there. Go to the website on your browser at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl or use an Android phone. No patrons to thank this week. Maybe you'd like to sign up. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week.